You've heard the stories. A single man standing on a bridge, sword drawn, holding back a river of enemies. It sounds like fantasy, the kind of scene invented to sell tickets. And yet the archives are full of these moments, recorded by sober chroniclers, corroborated by enemies, sometimes rewarded with a nation's highest honors. So the real question is not whether one warrior can fight an army. It's how. Because when you look closely at these 7 cases, spread across 2,000 years and 4 continents, you find they share a hidden logic. Not superhuman muscle, something far stranger and far more useful. Begin in Rome, around the year 508 before the Common Era, when the city was barely a city at all. An exiled king, Tarquin, had persuaded the Etruscan ruler Lars Porsena to march on the young republic. The Etruscan army arrived at the Tiber, and between them and Rome stood a single wooden bridge, the Pons Sublicius. If the enemy crossed, Rome fell that afternoon. According to Livy, a soldier named Horatius Cocles understood something the panicking defenders did not. The bridge was narrow. A narrow space does not care how large your army is. It only permits a few men to fight at once. So Horatius told the Romans behind him to tear the bridge down while he held the far end. 2 companions stood with him at first. Then, as the timbers began to give way, he sent them back and faced the Etruscans alone. The mathematics of the choke point did the rest. Thousands of men could only send 2 or 3 forward at a time, and each pair had to step over the bodies of the last. When the bridge finally collapsed into the river behind him, Horatius, by Livy's account, prayed to the river god and plunged into the Tiber in full armor, swimming back to a cheering city. Here you meet the first controversy. Polybius, an earlier and often more careful historian, says Horatius drowned. Livy says he lived and was rewarded with as much land as he could plow in a day. The disagreement matters because it reveals what these stories really are. They are not simply reports. They are investments. Rome needed a founding legend of individual courage, and Horatius became its stock character, retold until the drowning was quietly edited out. The feat may be real. The version you remember was engineered. Now travel 1,500 years forward and several thousand miles north to a bridge in northern England in September 1066. Harold Godwinson, King of England, has just surprised a Norwegian invasion force at Stamford Bridge. The Norwegians are scattered on the wrong side of the river Derwent, and the only way to reach them is across a single, narrow crossing. This is where the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records something extraordinary. One lone Norseman, a giant with an axe, planted himself on the bridge and refused to move. The same geometry that saved Rome now protected an entire retreating army. The Englishmen could only approach 1 or 2 at a time, and one by one they fell. The Chronicle claims he killed 40 men and single-handedly stalled the advance of a victorious army. He was finally killed not by a braver warrior, but by a cleverer one. An Englishman floated downstream in a barrel, drifted beneath the planks, and thrust a spear up through the gaps into the giant above. The lesson is almost comic in its clarity. You do not defeat the choke point by charging it. You defeat it by refusing to play its game. The pattern is now visible, so watch it appear a 3rd time, and notice that it is no accident. Early in the 16th century, during the Italian Wars, a French knight named Pierre Terrail, remembered as the Chevalier de Bayard, is said to have defended a bridge over the Garigliano River against roughly 200 Spanish horsemen, while his comrades escaped. Bayard was already famous as the knight without fear and beyond reproach. And once again, the story hinges not on his strength, but on the width of the planks beneath his feet. Cavalry, the most fearsome weapon of the age, becomes useless when the terrain forbids a charge. 200 horsemen against one man sounds impossible. 2 horsemen against one man, over and over, is merely difficult. 3 bridges, 3 legends, 1 principle. A bridge is the great equalizer, a place where the size of an army stops being an advantage and starts being a liability, because the men in the rear cannot help the men in front, and the corpses of the fallen become a barricade against their own side. Understand this, and the impossible becomes engineering. But terrain is only half the secret. The other half is what happens inside the minds of the attackers. For that, go to China in the year 197, to the chaos of the Three Kingdoms era, and to a bodyguard named Dian Wei. His master, the warlord Cao Cao, had been betrayed in the night by a supposed ally, and enemy soldiers were pouring into the camp. Cao Cao needed to escape, and Dian Wei placed himself in the gateway of the camp to buy time. The gate, like the bridge, was a choke point. But the records of the Three Kingdoms describe something beyond geometry. When his long halberd was lost, he fought with a sword. When the sword shattered, he seized 2 enemy soldiers bodily and used them as clubs. Struck by dozens of wounds, he died still standing in the gateway, glaring, and for a moment not one enemy soldier dared to step over his body. That hesitation is the second weapon. A defender who will not fall, who seems not to feel his wounds, does not just block a path physically. He blocks it psychologically. Armies are not single organisms. They are thousands of individuals, each one privately calculating whether he wants to be the next man forward. One warrior who radiates certain death can freeze that calculation across an entire front. Terror is contagious, and a lone man in a doorway can infect 1,000. Nowhere is that idea made more literal than in Japan, in the year 1189, in the death of the warrior monk Benkei. He served Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a brilliant general hunted down by his own jealous brother. Cornered at last, Yoshitsune retreated inside a residence to end his own life with honor, and Benkei stood at the entrance to hold off the attacking army long enough for his master to finish. The soldiers, wary of the enormous monk, resorted to arrows. They filled him with shafts until he looked, in the words of the legend, like a pincushion. And then they waited. And he did not fall. For a long time none of them advanced, because the giant still stood upright, weapon in hand, blocking the way. Only when a nervous soldier finally rode past and the body toppled did they realize Benkei had been dead for some time, held upright by his own planted stance. The Japanese gave this its own name, the standing death of Benkei. Whether it happened exactly so is impossible to prove, but the story survives precisely because it captures the truth Dian Wei's gateway hinted at. The most effective defender is one the enemy is too frightened to test. Now, you might assume all of this belongs to the age of swords and superstition, that modern firepower ended the era of the lone warrior forever. In fact, industrial warfare produced the most verifiable examples of all, documented not by poets, but by witness statements, medical reports, and military tribunals awarding medals under strict scrutiny. In May 1945, in the jungles of Burma, a Gurkha rifleman named Lachiman Gurung was in a forward trench when a large Japanese force attacked in the night. Grenades landed among his position. He threw the first back. He threw the second back. The third exploded in his right hand, blowing off his fingers, shredding his arm, and blinding him in one eye. His two comrades were badly wounded and out of the fight. So for 4 hours, alone, working the bolt of his rifle with his one good hand, he held the trench. When dawn came, 31 Japanese dead lay in front of his position. He had shouted defiance the entire night, and the enemy, unable to see how few defenders remained, believed the position held far more men. He received the Victoria Cross. The choke point this time was a single trench, and the psychology was the same as Benkei's. The attackers fought the size of the threat they imagined, not the one that existed. 8 months earlier, and half a world away, in the frozen fields near Holtzwihr in eastern France, a young American lieutenant named Audie Murphy faced 6 German tanks and hundreds of infantry with a mere handful of men and no cover. He ordered his soldiers to fall back into the woods. Then he climbed onto a burning American tank destroyer, its dead crew still inside, and turned its .50 caliber machine gun on the advancing Germans. The vehicle could have exploded beneath him at any second. For roughly an hour he stood there, exposed, wounded in the leg, mowing down infantry as they tried to close in, and at one point calmly directing artillery fire onto his own position by radio. When asked later how close the enemy got, he is said to have replied that he'd let them come until they were about to shoot him. He killed or wounded around 50 men and stopped the attack. He became the most decorated American soldier of the war. 7 warriors, then, across 25 centuries. And here is where the illusion finally dissolves. Not one of them won by being stronger than an army. Horatius, the Norseman, and Bayard won by standing where numbers could not count. Dian Wei and Benkei won by becoming too terrifying to approach. Gurung and Murphy won by convincing an enemy that a single desperate man was a wall of defenders. The lone warrior against the army is not a story about muscle. It is a story about geometry, psychology, and information. About denying an army the 2 things it needs most, which are room to bring its numbers to bear, and accurate knowledge of what it is facing. And there is one final twist, the one that ties all 7 together. In almost every case, the man was buying time for someone else. Horatius held the bridge so Rome could destroy it. Dian Wei died so Cao Cao could ride away. Benkei stood so his master could choose his own death. Gurung held the trench so his line would not break. Murphy climbed the tank so his men could reach the trees. The lone warrior is almost never fighting to win. He is fighting to spend himself, to convert one life into minutes, and minutes into the survival of everyone behind him. That is why these stories outlived the empires that produced them. They are not really celebrations of impossible strength. They are the oldest lesson armies ever learned and never stopped needing, that a single person, standing in exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment, willing to pay everything, can bend the arithmetic of an entire war. The bridge was never the miracle. The man who understood the bridge was.